The first time I saw my father cry in public, he was standing in the middle of the Maplewood Veterans Hall holding a folded newspaper with my photograph on the front page. Not a wedding picture, not a graduation portrait, a Pentagon security photo. I was walking beside a senior defense official in Washington, D.C. wearing my navy dress whites, while two armed federal agents escorted us toward a secure entrance. The article headline read, "Ohio-born Navy officer helps lead emergency evacuation of American civilians." My father stared at that picture like he was looking at a stranger. Then he said the words nobody in that room ever expected to hear from Frank Whitmore. I think I may have been wrong about my daughter. The room went silent. My brother Danny nearly dropped his coffee. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. And me, I wasn't even there to hear it. I was sitting alone in a government sedan outside Arlington National Cemetery when my phone started vibrating for the fourth time in 10 minutes. "Mom calling." I let it ring. The driver pretended not to notice. Outside the window, November rain slid slowly down rows of bare trees and white headstones. Washington always looked colder than Ohio, even when the temperatures matched. Maybe because everybody there carried invisible things on their shoulders. Finally, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail. "Rebecca," my mother said softly, "please call us back. We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." Family meeting? I almost laughed out loud. For 38 years, nobody in my family had ever called a meeting when I was hurting. Not when I left for Annapolis. Not during deployments. Not after Grandma Eleanor died. But one newspaper photo later, suddenly everybody wanted to talk. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. And just like that, I was 12 years old again. Back in Maplewood, Ohio. Back before I understood that some families can love you and still never truly see you. Maplewood was the kind of small Midwestern town where people still mowed lawns in straight lines and waved at strangers from pickup trucks. My father worked 32 years at the Champion Tool Factory before they downsized half the plant in the early 2000s. My mother worked part-time at the church office. We weren't poor, but every dollar had a purpose. My brother Danny fit naturally into that world. Football captain, loud laugh, easy confidence, the kind of man people slapped on the back at barbecues. I was quieter. Books, school, structure. And from the time I was little, my father looked at me like I was built wrong somehow. Not bad, just disappointing. Danny could bring home a C- report card and Dad would say, "That boy's got people skills. That matters more than grades." I once brought home straight A's and a county writing award. Dad nodded without looking up from the television. "That's nice, Becca." That was it. That's nice. You'd be surprised how long a little sentence can live inside somebody. By high school, I stopped expecting applause. But my grandmother Eleanor noticed everything. Grandma lived in a small white house near the edge of town, with wind chimes hanging from the porch, and old military photographs tucked into drawers she rarely opened. Most people in Maplewood only knew her as a church volunteer who baked peach cobbler for funerals. What they didn't know was that Eleanor Whitmore had once been an army nurse in Korea. She never bragged about it. Never wore veteran hats. Never marched in parades, but sometimes late at night she'd sit at the kitchen table with coffee and tell me stories in a voice so calm they almost hurt more. Young boys missing legs. Soldiers crying for mothers. Cold mornings near field hospitals. "Service isn't glamorous," she told me once while polishing an old pair of military shoes. "Most important work happens quietly." I think she knew I needed to hear that, because by 16 I'd already learned my father measured worth in noise. And I wasn't noisy enough. The worst moment came my junior year of high school. Dad was outside grilling burgers while neighbors stood around drinking beer in our backyard. I was carrying empty soda cans inside when I heard one of the men ask about my college plans. Dad laughed. "Becca's smart, sure, but nobody builds a real legacy sitting behind military paperwork." Everybody chuckled politely. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. Military paperwork. Like my dream already sounded foolish before it even began. That night, Grandma Eleanor drove me to Dairy Queen and listened while I cried in the passenger seat. She didn't insult my father. Didn't tell me life was unfair. She just handed me a napkin and said something I never forgot. "Don't argue with people who can't see your worth. Just keep walking until the world does." Years later, those words followed me through every difficult mile of my life. Through Annapolis. Through deployments. Through lonely apartments. Through holidays spent on military bases while Danny posted smiling family photos from backyard cookouts back home. And through the phone call that finally broke something open between my father and me. It happened 3 weeks before my promotion ceremony outside Washington. I stood in my apartment kitchen staring at the invitation while working up the courage to call home. I should have known better at 38 years old. But part of me still hoped. Dad answered on the third ring. "What's going on, Rebecca?" I explained carefully. "Promotion ceremony. Commander rank. Small event near D.C. Would mean a lot if they came." Long silence. Then his voice hardened. "Nobody cares about your cheap little promotion." I felt something inside me go completely still. My mother got on the line briefly afterward. "You know your father doesn't mean things harshly." But he did mean them. That was the problem. The ceremony happened anyway. Rows of white uniforms. Brass music drifting through cold air. Official speeches. Applause. Other officers hugging parents and spouses while cameras flashed. I stood alone afterward holding my cap under one arm, until I felt an old hand squeeze my shoulder. Captain Harold Bennett, 80 years old. Former Army medic. One of Grandma Eleanor's oldest friends. "She'd be proud of you," he said quietly. I nearly lost composure right there. Because sometimes a single sentence from the right person matters more than praise from everybody else combined. 3 months later, the Pentagon assignment changed my life. Then came the newspaper photo. Then came my mother's call. And now, sitting outside Arlington Cemetery with rain tapping softly against the car window, I finally listened to the voicemail again. "We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." I looked toward the cemetery gates and whispered the words I wished Grandma Eleanor could hear. "You were the only one who saw me before the world did." Then I told the driver to take me home to Ohio. By the time I crossed the Ohio state line, the trees had already turned the dull brown color that comes right before winter settles in for good. I hadn't driven home in nearly 8 months. Long enough for the roads to feel familiar and distant at the same time. The farther west I drove from Washington, the quieter everything became. Less traffic, fewer sirens, more pickup trucks with veteran bumper stickers and rust forming around the wheel wells. I rolled the window down near Zanesville just to smell cold farmland again. People who grow up in small towns understand this feeling. No matter how far you go, part of your nervous system stays tied to old roads and grain silos and church bells. But as Maplewood got closer, my stomach tightened harder with every mile marker. Because deep down I knew this family meeting wasn't really about reconciliation. It was about recognition. And there's a difference. When I finally pulled into town, the first thing I noticed was the Christmas wreaths already hanging from downtown lampposts, even though Thanksgiving was still 2 weeks away. Maplewood always decorated early. The second thing I noticed was that people were staring at me. At the gas station. At the pharmacy parking lot. Even through diner windows. That newspaper article had traveled fast. Small towns survive on gossip the way cities survive on electricity. I stopped at Miller's Pharmacy to grab aspirin after the drive, and before I even reached the counter, old Mrs. Granger from church grabbed my arm. "Well, look at you," she said, smiling wide. "Pentagon and bodyguards now." I forced a polite laugh. "Mostly paperwork and coffee, honestly." She shook her head. "Your Grandma Eleanor would be over the moon." That hit me harder than I expected. Because almost nobody mentioned Grandma anymore. After she died, it felt like the town quietly folded her memory away into casseroles and funeral flowers. But not me. I carried her everywhere. Even now, I still kept her old service pin inside my coat pocket during difficult meetings. Mrs. Granger lowered her voice. "Your father's been acting strange since that article came out." I raised an eyebrow. "Strange how? He keeps buying extra newspapers." She smiled gently. "That man's probably read your article 20 times." I didn't know what to say to that. Because part of me wanted satisfaction. Another part wanted to cry. And another part, the tiredest part, just wanted everyone to stop making my worth sound surprising. I left the pharmacy and drove slowly toward my parents' neighborhood. Nothing there had changed. Same cracked sidewalks, same American flags hanging from porches, same little ranch houses built for factory families back when people believed one steady job could carry a household forever. Danny's truck was already parked outside Mom and Dad's house when I arrived. Of course it was. My older brother never missed a chance to control a room. I sat in my car for nearly 2 minutes before getting out. The November wind cut straight through my coat. And suddenly I remembered being 18 years old, standing in this exact driveway with 2 suitcases before leaving for Annapolis. Dad barely hugged me that day. Mom cried. Danny joked that I'd come home in 6 months begging for real food. Only Grandma Eleanor looked at me like she understood what it cost to leave home for service. I can still hear her final words before I climbed into that shuttle bus. "Walk steady. Not be fearless. Not be perfect. Just walk steady." The front door opened before I reached it. My mother rushed outside first. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, wrapping her arms around me. "Rebecca." She hadn't called me Rebecca with tenderness in years. Usually it was just Becca shouted across noisy family dinners. I hugged her back carefully. She smelled like hand lotion and cinnamon candles. For one brief second, I almost allowed myself to believe this visit might actually heal something. Then Danny appeared behind her. "Well," he said loudly, "look who finally remembered us little people." There it was. The old rhythm. Sarcasm disguised as humor. I forced a small smile. "Good to see you, too." Danny stepped forward and hugged me quickly, but something about it felt performative. Like he was already imagining himself telling people about his Pentagon sister at the bar later. Inside the house buzzed with noise. Aunts, cousins, even neighbors. I stopped dead near the living room doorway. "You invited people?" I asked quietly. Mom looked nervous immediately. "Well, folks were excited you were coming home." Excited. Interesting word. Nobody had been excited when I graduated Annapolis, or during my first deployment, or when Grandma Eleanor's funeral nearly emptied my savings because I paid for most of it myself while Danny complained about floral costs. But one newspaper article later, suddenly I was interesting. I kept my expression neutral. "Military training teaches you how to lock emotions behind your teeth." Still, my chest burned. Dad emerged from the dining room holding coffee. For a second, neither of us spoke. Frank Whitmore had aged more than I realized. His shoulders sagged lower now, more gray around the temples. His hands looked rougher, too. Factory hands. Working man hands. The kind that built half this country and silently destroyed the bodies attached to them. Then he nodded awkwardly. "Long drive." "About 7 hours." He cleared his throat. "Saw your article," I figured. Another silence. Everybody nearby pretended not to listen. Dad shifted uncomfortably before finally saying words that sounded almost physically painful for him. "People around town seem pretty impressed. Not 'I'm proud of you.' Not even congratulations. Just people seem impressed." I almost smiled at how predictable it was. "Town always did like headlines," I answered calmly. Danny laughed too loudly. "Well, you're basically famous now. Mom's been saving newspapers like you're a Kennedy." Mom shot him a look. The room filled with uncomfortable chuckles. Then Aunt Linda walked over carrying deviled eggs and touched my arm. "Your grandmother always said you were destined for something important." There it was again. Grandma Eleanor, the only person whose faith in me never changed with public opinion. I looked around the crowded living room. Football game playing softly on television. Cheap folding chairs pulled from the garage. Pot roast smell drifting from the kitchen. Middle-aged relatives suddenly eager to hear Pentagon stories after years of barely asking about my life. And right then I understood something clearly. They didn't know me at all. Not really. They knew the newspaper version. The impressive version. The version validated by strangers. But nobody in this room knew how many nights I cried alone after deployments. How many holidays I spent eating microwave dinners on base. How hard I worked to become someone my father still couldn't quite say he respected. Then the front door opened again. Cold air swept inside, and when I saw who stepped through that doorway holding an old leather satchel in his weathered hands, my heart nearly stopped. Captain Harold Bennett, Grandma Eleanor's old Army medic partner, 82 years old and still standing straight. The entire room turned toward him in confusion. But I already knew. This was the real reason I came home, and suddenly my family had no idea what was about to walk into that living room. Captain Harold Bennett removed his wool coat, slowly, carefully folding it over one arm, while the entire living room stared at him. Nobody in my family recognized him except me. But the second I saw the old Army Corps pin on his lapel, I felt 16 years old again, sitting at Grandma Eleanor's kitchen table, listening to stories about soldiers who never came home. Harold looked older than the last time I'd seen him at my promotion ceremony. Thinner, too, but his eyes were still sharp. "Rebecca," he said warmly. I crossed the room before anybody else could speak and hugged him tightly. "I didn't know you were coming." He smiled faintly. "Your grandmother taught me surprises matter." That got my father's attention immediately. "Harold Bennett," Dad asked cautiously. "From Eleanor's old stories." Harold nodded once. "That's right." Dad shook his hand with visible uncertainty. Now here's the thing about men from my father's generation, especially working-class Midwestern men. Military service meant something sacred to them even if they rarely talked about emotions. A veteran from Korea automatically carried weight in a room like this, which meant Harold's presence changed the atmosphere immediately. The joking stopped. The performance softened. Mom hurried to make coffee while Harold settled slowly into Dad's old recliner near the fireplace. "You look just like your grandmother around the eyes," he told me quietly. I swallowed hard. Nobody had said that to me since her funeral. The room eventually reorganized itself into awkward conversation. Cousins wandered toward the kitchen. The football game kept playing in the background. Somebody dropped ice into glasses. But underneath it all, tension hummed quietly. Because everybody sensed Harold hadn't come just for dinner. He brought something with him. The old leather satchel rested against his chair the entire time. Dad noticed it too. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of shallow small talk about traffic weather and Washington politics, Harold cleared his throat. "I came because Eleanor asked me to." The room went completely still. My mother blinked. "Asked you to?" Harold nodded slowly. "Before she passed." Dad frowned. That was 3 years ago. She knew her time was running out. I felt cold suddenly. Harold rested both hands on the satchel. "She gave me instructions. Told me there would come a day Rebecca finally came home after proving herself to people who never fully saw her." Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for coffee. And for the first time all evening, my father looked genuinely uncomfortable. Harold opened the satchel carefully and removed a worn black journal tied with faded blue ribbon. I recognized it instantly. Grandma Eleanor's handwriting covered the front. Dad stared at it in confusion. "I've never seen that before." "No," Harold answered quietly, "because she kept it private." He looked toward me. "She wrote in it for almost 20 years. The room suddenly felt too small. Harold untied the ribbon slowly. "Eleanor asked me to give this to Rebecca one day, but only after the family was finally willing to listen." Danny shifted awkwardly on the couch. "Listen to what?" Harold opened the journal and adjusted his glasses. Then he began reading. "March 14th, 2004, he said softly. "Frank thinks Rebecca is too quiet for this world. He worries quiet people get ignored. What he doesn't understand is that quiet people often survive things loud people never could." My throat tightened instantly. Mom lowered her eyes. Harold turned another page. "Rebecca sat with me tonight polishing old service shoes. She asks thoughtful questions, notices details. That girl carries loneliness in her chest like a grown woman already." I couldn't breathe properly. Because suddenly Grandma's voice existed in the room again. Warm, steady, certain. Harold continued. "I fear Rebecca spends her whole life trying to earn affection that should have been given freely." Dad looked down at the carpet. Danny folded his arms defensively. Nobody interrupted. Outside, wind rattled dry leaves across the porch. Harold read another passage. "Frank praises confidence because he understands confidence. But Rebecca's strength is different. Hers is endurance." That sentence nearly broke me. Because somebody had finally named it correctly. My entire life wasn't built on brilliance or charm or attention. It was built on endurance. Harold paused and looked at my father. "She loved you very much, Frank, but she worried about the things you couldn't say." Dad rubbed his jaw uncomfortably. "I did my best." Harold nodded gently. "I know you believe that." That answer landed harder than an accusation would have. The room stayed silent another moment before Danny finally spoke. "So what this is all supposed to make us feel guilty?" I looked at my brother carefully. He sounded irritated, but underneath it I heard something else. Fear. Harold closed the journal halfway. "No, Eleanor hated guilt. She believed guilt without growth is useless." Danny scoffed softly. "Then why now?" Harold looked directly at him. "Because your sister spent 20 years becoming someone this family should have appreciated long before strangers did." Nobody spoke after that. Not even Danny. The football commentators droned softly from the television while the weight of Harold's words settled across the room like snowfall. And sitting there surrounded by relatives, I realized something painful. I'd spent most of my life thinking success would finally heal old wounds. That enough promotions, accomplishments, or recognition would eventually make my father look at me differently. But sitting there now, I understood the truth. Success doesn't erase childhood hurt. It just changes who witnesses it. Harold opened the journal again. "One more thing," he said quietly. He reached into the satchel and removed an old envelope with my name written across the front in Eleanor's careful handwriting. My hands trembled immediately. Dad stared at it. "When did she write that?" 2 weeks before she died. Harold handed it to me gently. "She told me Rebecca would need it someday after the world finally noticed her, but before bitterness hardened permanently inside her." The room disappeared around me. All I could see was Grandma's handwriting. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single folded page. I recognized the scent instantly. Lavender. Her old perfume. My vision blurred before I even started reading. And then I saw the first line. "If you're reading this, sweetheart, it means they finally see what I always did." I had to stop. My chest hurt too badly. Mom quietly began crying near the kitchen doorway. Dad still hadn't spoken. Not once. Harold leaned back slowly and folded his weathered hands. Then, in the gentlest voice imaginable, he said the words that changed the entire night. "Frank, your daughter didn't become extraordinary because the world praised her." He looked directly at my father. "She became extraordinary because she learned how to survive without it." Nobody moved for several seconds after Harold said those words. The football game kept playing softly in the background, but nobody was watching anymore. My father sat in his recliner staring at the carpet with both hands locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I'd seen Frank Whitmore angry 1,000 times in my life, seen him sarcastic, dismissive, proud, but never uncertain. This looked different, older somehow, like a man slowly realizing memory might not tell the same story as truth. Mom finally wiped her eyes with a napkin and tried to steady herself. "Maybe we should eat," she whispered. "That's what people from our generation of families do when emotions become too large. They feed everybody." So plates started moving around the dining room table. Pot roast. Mashed potatoes. Green beans cooked too long the way my father liked them. The normalcy almost felt absurd after everything Harold had read aloud. But I appreciated it too. Because real American families rarely heal through dramatic speeches. Most healing happens while somebody passes gravy quietly and avoids eye contact. I sat beside Harold while Danny poured himself bourbon 2 fingers too heavy. That alone told me he was rattled. Danny only drank like that when life stopped behaving predictably. Across the table, Dad finally looked toward me. "You never said Harold was still around." I kept my tone calm. "You never asked." The words landed harder than I intended. Dad lowered his eyes immediately. Mom jumped in quickly. "Your father didn't mean—" "I know what he meant," I answered gently. And I did. That was the problem. Nobody at that table was cruel in the cartoon villain way people imagine when they hear stories like mine. My parents paid bills, showed up for emergencies, made sure we had food. Dad worked overtime most of his adult life. Mom packed lunches and folded laundry and drove us to dentist appointments. From the outside, we looked like a perfectly decent American family. But emotional neglect rarely looks dramatic from the street. It looks ordinary. That's why people miss it for years. Dinner moved awkwardly at first. Silverware scraping plates, small talk trying desperately to survive. Finally, Danny leaned back in his chair and exhaled loudly. "So, what exactly do you do over there?" he asked me. "At the Pentagon." I almost laughed. Because in 38 years, my brother had never once shown genuine curiosity about my career until strangers started admiring it. "Mostly coordination work," I said. Danny smirked faintly. That newspaper made it sound pretty important. Harold glanced at him carefully. Some work matters even when nobody sees it. Danny took another sip of bourbon. "Well, apparently everybody sees it now." There it was again, that edge in his voice. The resentment. I studied my brother quietly. Danny had once been handsome in the easy hometown way. Broad shoulders, thick hair, big personality. But stress changes people. His face looked puffier now. His smile strained at the corners. And for the first time in my life, I realized Danny wasn't actually happy. Not truly. He'd spent decades playing the role everybody expected from him. Golden son. Local success story. Family man. But something underneath had started cracking. Dad cleared his throat suddenly. "Business still giving you trouble?" Danny stiffened immediately. "There's no trouble." Mom and Dad exchanged a quick glance. So there it was. The thing nobody was discussing openly. I leaned back quietly and let the silence stretch. Eventually, Danny shrugged. "Economy's rough right now." "What happened?" I asked carefully. Danny hesitated. Then he laughed bitterly. "What happened is people stopped buying things they don't need." Turns out Danny's construction supply company had been bleeding money for over a year. Rising fuel costs, bad loans, 2 commercial clients who never paid invoices. He'd hidden most of it from the family while trying to maintain appearances. But small-town reputations can become prisons. Once everybody thinks you're successful, admitting failure starts feeling impossible. Dad stared down at his plate. I offered to help. Danny's jaw tightened. "I don't need rescuing." The irony nearly overwhelmed me. My whole life, Danny had been the one celebrated for staying local and building something real. Meanwhile, I was the unrealistic daughter chasing military paperwork. And now here we sat. Me financially stable but emotionally exhausted. Danny emotionally defensive and financially drowning. Funny how life rearranges assumptions with age. Harold quietly sipped coffee before speaking again. Eleanor used to worry about both of you kids. Mom looked surprised. Both. Harold nodded. She worried Rebecca would feel unseen, and she worried Danny would become trapped trying to stay admired. Danny looked away immediately. Because even now at 42 years old, my brother still lived like the town's opinion controlled oxygen itself. The conversation drifted after that. People started discussing old neighbors, factory closures, church gossip. But underneath everything, tension kept simmering. Finally, Dad stood up slowly and walked toward the living room window. Snow had started falling lightly outside, tiny flakes drifting beneath the porch light. Without turning around, he spoke quietly. You know what the hardest thing about getting old is? Nobody answered. Dad folded his arms. You spend your whole life thinking you understand people. He paused. Then one day, you realize you missed important things sitting right in front of you. The room went silent again. Mom stared at him like she'd never heard him speak this honestly before. Dad still faced the window. When Rebecca was little, she never asked for much. His voice roughened slightly. I thought quiet meant strong. My chest tightened. And maybe sometimes he continued quiet means lonely. Nobody moved. Harold lowered his eyes respectfully. Danny rubbed his forehead hard with one hand. And me! I felt anger and sadness colliding together so hard I couldn't separate them anymore. Because this was all I ever wanted. Not applause. Not headlines. Not Pentagon articles. Just acknowledgement. Simple acknowledgement that my feelings had existed all along. Dad finally turned toward me. I read that article 3 times before I recognized you. That sentence hurt more than the original insult ever had. Because buried inside it was the truth. The world had introduced my father to his own daughter. He walked back toward the table slowly. Then, after a long silence, he asked the question I never expected him to ask. Rebecca, were we really that hard on you? The room held its breath. I looked at my father carefully. Really looked at him. Not the giant figure from childhood. Just an aging man carrying mistakes he didn't fully understand until too late. And for the first time in my life, I decided not to protect him from the answer. Yes, I said quietly. Nobody spoke after that. Outside, snow continued falling over Maplewood. And deep down, I think every person in that house understood the real family meeting had finally begun. After Dad admitted it, nobody at the table seemed to know what came next. That's the thing people don't tell you about long-awaited moments. Truth doesn't arrive with music playing in the background. Sometimes it just sits there awkwardly beside the mashed potatoes while everybody avoids looking directly at each other. Mom eventually stood and began clearing dishes with trembling hands. I'll make coffee, she whispered again, even though there was already coffee sitting untouched on the counter. Danny disappeared onto the back porch with his bourbon. And Dad stayed, standing beside the dining room table, staring at me like he was trying to reconcile 2 different versions of his daughter at the same time. The little quiet girl from Maplewood, and the woman from the Pentagon newspaper article. Harold broke the silence first. Frank, he said gently, why don't you tell her the truth? Dad frowned slightly. I already did. No, Harold answered calmly. You admitted regret. That's different from truth. Dad's jaw tightened. Men from my father's generation weren't taught how to unpack emotions. They were taught how to survive layoffs, fix engines, and ignore chest pain until somebody forced them to see a doctor. Emotional language always sounded foreign coming from him. But Harold waited patiently. Finally, Dad sat down heavily in his chair. And for the first time in my entire life, my father spoke to me without sounding like he was trying to win something. When you were little, he began slowly, you scared me. I blinked in surprise. Me? Dad nodded. You noticed everything. Nobody had ever said that to me before. He rubbed his rough hands together while searching for words. Danny was easy, loud kid, tough kid. If he got hurt, he yelled. If he wanted something, he asked. He looked up at me carefully. You just got quiet. I swallowed hard. Dad exhaled slowly. When your grandmother died, she told me something at the hospital I never forgot. He paused. Frank, one day you're gonna realize your daughter stopped bringing her feelings to you because you kept teaching her they were inconvenient. Mom froze near the kitchen counter. Apparently she'd never heard that either. Dad stared at the table. I got angry at Eleanor for saying it. His voice cracked slightly. But after you left for Annapolis, the house changed. I leaned forward slightly despite myself. How? He gave a sad little laugh. Too quiet. That nearly broke me. Because all those years I thought nobody noticed my absence. But apparently they did. They just noticed too late. Dad shook his head slowly. You stopped calling as much after the academy. I got busy. No, he said quietly. You got careful. The room fell silent again. And he was right. By my mid-20s, every conversation with home became emotionally measured. Safe topics only. Weather, travel, schedules. Never disappointment. Never loneliness. Never the ache of constantly feeling emotionally optional inside your own family. Harold leaned back in his chair, watching both of us carefully. Eleanor always believed families survive through honesty, he said. Danny suddenly walked back inside from the porch. Well, honesty's easy for dead people, he muttered. Mom immediately frowned. Danny! No, seriously, he continued, dropping into his chair again. Everybody's acting like Becca had this horrible childhood. I looked at him calmly. I never said horrible. But that's what everybody's implying. His face flushed red now, bourbon sharpening his emotions. We had food, Christmases, vacations sometimes. Dad worked himself half to death for us. I know that. So what exactly are we apologizing for? There it was, the question hanging over the whole night. What counts as damage when nobody hit you? I folded my hands together carefully. Do you remember my high school graduation? I asked him. Danny shrugged. Sure. Dad missed it because your baseball tournament got rescheduled. Danny rolled his eyes slightly. That was one thing. It was a lot of things. He opened his mouth again, but I kept going. When I got accepted into Annapolis, Dad told neighbors he hoped I'd grow out of military fantasies. Danny shifted uncomfortably. When I made lieutenant, nobody came to the ceremony. Mom whispered softly. We couldn't afford the travel. I looked at her gently. You flew to Cancun for Danny's anniversary 2 years later. That one landed hard. Mom sat down slowly after that. Danny rubbed his forehead. You're keeping score now. No, I answered quietly. I'm explaining why I stopped expecting support. The room went still again. And then unexpectedly Dad spoke. She's right. Danny turned toward him immediately. Dad. No, Dad shook his head. She's right. Hearing my father say that out loud felt surreal. He looked exhausted now. Older than I'd ever seen him. I spent years thinking toughness meant treating everybody the same, he said. But kids aren't the same. Danny needed pushing. Rebecca needed encouragement. I felt tears threatening finally. Not because the pain disappeared, but because somebody was finally naming it correctly. Dad stared at me across the table. You know the worst part. I said nothing. I thought I was preparing you for disappointment. His voice roughened. Turns out I became the disappointment. Nobody moved. Even Danny stayed quiet after that. Then Harold reached into his satchel again. There's something else Eleanor wanted Rebecca to have. He removed a small stack of papers clipped together. Old documents, typed forms, letters. I frowned in confusion. What is that? Harold smiled faintly. Your scholarship application. I blinked. My what? The military scholarship that helped pay for your academy preparation program. I stared at him. I thought the foundation selected me. They did. Harold nodded. But Eleanor recommended you. The room froze. Dad looked stunned. Eleanor did what? Harold handed me the papers. She contacted former service connections quietly, told them her granddaughter had discipline, intelligence, and grit. My hands trembled, turning the pages. There it was. Grandma's signature. Letters of recommendation. Handwritten notes praising me in ways nobody else ever had. She never told me, I whispered. She didn't want you feeling indebted, Harold answered. She wanted you believing you earned it. My vision blurred again. All these years, Grandma had been protecting my future behind the scenes while I thought I climbed alone. Dad suddenly covered his eyes with one hand. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. She believed in you more than I did. I looked at my father quietly. Then I answered with the deepest truth I knew. She had practiced seeing people clearly. The next morning, I woke before sunrise in my old childhood bedroom. For a moment, lying there under the faded quilt my mother had sewn sometime in the early 90s, I forgot where I was. Then I heard the furnace rattling through the walls, smelled coffee downstairs, and remembered everything. The family meeting, Grandma's journal, Dad admitting the truth. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before getting up. Outside the window, fresh snow covered Maplewood in soft white silence. The whole town looked gentler after snowfall, cleaner somehow. Funny how winter can make even old pain seem quieter for a few hours. I pulled on jeans and a sweater and walked downstairs expecting tension. Instead, I found my father alone at the kitchen table. No television. No newspaper. just coffee cooling beside his hands. He looked up when I entered. Morning. Morning. For years, conversations between us had always felt crowded with invisible things. Expectations, defensiveness, old disappointments stacked like furniture nobody wanted to move. But this morning felt different. Still uncomfortable. Still fragile. But honest. Dad gestured toward the coffee pot. Fresh if you want some. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him carefully. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Dad cleared his throat. Couldn't sleep much. Me neither. He nodded like that made sense. Because maybe it did. Some truths rearrange your entire memory overnight. Finally, he looked at me directly. You really paid for most of your grandmother's funeral. There it was. One of the many quiet facts nobody ever asked about. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. Danny was struggling financially back then. That's not what I asked. I met his eyes. Yes. Dad leaned back heavily in his chair. I didn't know. And for once I believed him. Not because he never could have known, but because nobody in this family had trained themselves to notice my sacrifices. I'd become too self-sufficient for my own good. That happens to a lot of women from my generation. You get praised for handling everything alone long enough that people stop imagining you might need help too. Dad rubbed his jaw slowly. Your mother told me you flew home 3 times while Eleanor was sick. I had leave saved up. You never mentioned how hard that was. I almost smiled sadly. You never asked. He nodded once like a man accepting a sentence he couldn't appeal. The kitchen clock ticked softly between us. Finally, Dad said something that surprised me. I used to think your grandmother spoiled you. I raised an eyebrow. She taught me discipline. She taught you confidence, he corrected quietly. And I didn't understand it. He stared down into his coffee. My father believed praise made people weak. There it was again. The inheritance nobody talks about enough. Not money. Not land. Emotional habits. Frank Whitmore had spent his entire life repeating lessons he never consciously chose. And somewhere along the way he'd mistaken emotional distance for strength. Dad exhaled slowly. When you were little, every time you cried, I thought I was supposed to toughen you up. My throat tightened instantly. You know what Eleanor told me once, he continued. Frank, not every child needs hardening. Some already carry too much inside them. I looked away toward the frosted kitchen window before tears could form. Because Grandma had understood me before I understood myself. The back door suddenly opened. Danny walked in wearing his old work jacket and carrying the smell of cold air with him. He looked exhausted. Like he hadn't slept at all. Morning, he muttered. Dad nodded. Danny grabbed coffee, then stood awkwardly near the counter before finally speaking. I got a call from the bank. Dad's expression darkened immediately. How bad? Danny laughed humorlessly. They're giving me 60 days. The room fell silent. He stared into his cup. I might lose the warehouse. For years, Danny had been the family success story. Local business owner. High school sports legend. The son who stayed. And suddenly he looked just as frightened as I'd felt at 22 sitting alone in military housing during my first deployment. Different circumstances. Same loneliness. Dad stood slowly. We'll figure something out. Danny shook his head immediately. No, I'm done pretending I've got everything handled. That surprised me more than anything. Because pride runs deep in families like ours. Especially among men. Danny finally looked directly at me. You want to know something awful? I stayed quiet. I hated that newspaper article. The honesty in his voice stunned the room. Danny laughed bitterly. Everybody in town suddenly talking about my little sister like she's some hero. He rubbed his forehead. And all I could think was, when did she become the successful one? Dad frowned sharply. Danny. No, let him talk, I said quietly. Danny swallowed hard. You escaped this place. His eyes reddened slightly. I stayed because everybody said I was the one who'd build something here. Nobody interrupted. Then your picture ends up in the paper looking important as hell while my business is falling apart. And there it was. Not hatred. Not cruelty. Just shame. Ugly, ordinary shame. The kind that quietly poisons families for years. Danny sat down heavily across from me. I kept waiting for you to fail, he admitted softly. Because if you failed too, then maybe staying here wouldn't feel like such a mistake. The room went completely still. I looked at my brother carefully, and for the first time in decades I saw him clearly too. Not the golden child. Not Dad's favorite. Just another aging person terrified his life hadn't become what he promised himself it would. Mom entered the kitchen halfway through the silence and immediately sensed the emotional wreckage in the room. What happened? Dad answered quietly. We finally stopped lying. Mom sat slowly beside him. Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute. Then I reached into my coat pocket and removed Grandma Eleanor's old Army service pin. I placed it carefully in the center of the kitchen table. Everybody stared at it. She used to tell me something before every deployment, I said softly. Dad looked at the pin like it carried her ghost. What? I took a slow breath. She said strength isn't measured by how long you hide pain. My voice trembled slightly. It's measured by what you choose to do after pain changes you. Nobody moved. Outside church bells rang softly somewhere across snow-covered Maplewood. And sitting there in my childhood kitchen beside the family that once made me feel invisible, I finally realized something unexpected. I didn't come home for revenge anymore. I came home because Grandma Eleanor spent her whole life teaching me not to become bitter. And now it was finally time to show my family what she left behind. 3 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony happened on a cold Saturday morning under a gray Ohio sky. The new sign outside the renovated brick building read, Eleanor Whitmore Veterans Resource Center. Simple, no giant flags, no dramatic slogans, just her name, exactly the way Grandma would have wanted it. I stood near the entrance, adjusting my gloves while volunteers carried folding chairs through the front doors. Across the parking lot, local veterans gathered slowly beneath clouds of visible breath. Old Marines in worn jackets, Army widows holding coffee cups, Vietnam veterans with canes. Men who rarely talked about pain, but carried it everywhere anyway. Maplewood had more veterans than people realized. Small towns usually do. They just suffer quietly. That morning, for the first time in years, I felt Grandma Eleanor everywhere. In the cold air. In the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the lobby. In the careful way volunteers arranged donated winter coats near the counseling office. She believed service only mattered if it continued helping people after applause disappeared. And somehow, despite everything, we had managed to build something worthy of her name. Harold stood beside me wearing his old army overcoat and a dark wool scarf. You nervous? He asked. A little. He smiled faintly. Good, means you care. The center itself had once been an abandoned insurance office near downtown Maplewood, empty for almost 7 years. Now it held grief counseling rooms, benefit assistance offices, transportation scheduling for elderly veterans, and weekly support meetings for military spouses and widows. Nothing glamorous. Just practical help. The kind Grandma respected most. Dad arrived early carrying 2 boxes of donated blankets from church. That alone would have shocked the old version of me. Frank Whitmore volunteering publicly for something emotional. Impossible 6 months ago. But people can soften if life humbles them enough. He set the boxes down near the lobby and glanced around quietly. Looks good. I smiled slightly. Thank you. Dad shoved his hands into his coat pockets awkwardly. Then he nodded toward the sign outside. Your grandmother would have liked this better than statues or speeches. She hated speeches. Dad chuckled softly. She hated long speeches. That tiny moment standing together joking gently about Grandma healed more in me than some dramatic apology ever could. Danny arrived next, carrying trays of pastries from the local bakery. His business still wasn't fully stable, but something inside him had changed after that night in the kitchen. He looked lighter now, less defensive. Turns out honesty exhausts people at first, but eventually it frees them. Coffee guy canceled, he announced, so I brought extra pastries to distract everybody. Mom rolled her eyes affectionately. There are enough cinnamon rolls here to feed a football stadium. Danny shrugged. Trauma response. Even Dad laughed at that, and hearing my father laugh with both his children instead of comparing us felt strangely unfamiliar. Beautiful, but unfamiliar. By 10 o'clock, nearly 80 people had gathered inside and outside the center. Far more than expected. Town council members, veterans groups, church families, even people who barely knew us personally. Because in towns like Maplewood, once somebody finally starts helping quietly suffering people, word spreads fast. A local reporter approached me near the entrance. Commander Whitmore, she began politely what inspired this project. I paused before answering. Then I looked toward the sign carrying Grandma Eleanor's name. My grandmother taught me something important, I said. A lot of people survive wars and spend the rest of their lives pretending they didn't bring any of it home with them. The reporter lowered her notebook slightly. And this center, this place gives people permission to stop pretending. She nodded slowly after that. No flashy quote needed. Just truth. A little before the ceremony began, Harold asked everyone to gather near the front entrance. Snow flurries drifted lightly around us while folding chairs scraped against pavement. Then Harold stepped forward, carefully holding a small note card in trembling hands. At 82 years old, his voice still carried quiet authority. "I served beside Eleanor Whitmore during Korea," he began, "and I can tell you something with certainty." The crowd grew still. She never cared about status, never cared about recognition. She cared about whether people felt abandoned. Dad lowered his eyes immediately. Harold continued, "She once told me the loneliest people in America are often the ones everybody assumes are doing fine." That line hit hard across the crowd. Because older Americans understand that kind of loneliness deeply. Harold looked toward me then. "Rebecca built this center because she understands service isn't about revenge against people who doubted you." He smiled softly. "It's about becoming strong enough to help anyway." I felt my throat tighten immediately. Then Harold stepped aside and gestured for my father to come forward. Dad looked genuinely startled. "I'm not giving a speech." Harold smiled. "Yes, you are." The crowd chuckled lightly. Dad looked trapped for a moment. Then slowly, very slowly, Frank Whitmore walked toward the microphone. I honestly don't think I'd ever seen him nervous before. He stared out at the crowd while cold wind moved across the parking lot. Finally, he cleared his throat. "My daughter spent most of her life believing this family didn't see her clearly." The entire crowd fell silent. Dad's voice roughened slightly. "And the painful thing is, she was right." Mom quietly wiped tears beside Danny. Dad shook his head once. "I thought strength meant criticizing people until they got tougher." He glanced toward me. "Turns out encouragement works a whole lot better." A few people laughed softly through emotion. Dad swallowed hard. "I spent years waiting for Rebecca to become someone impressive." His eyes reddened slightly. "What I missed was the fact she already was. That did it. That finally broke me. Not because the pain disappeared. Not because the past changed. But because after 38 years, my father finally saw me without needing the world's permission first." Dad looked out at the crowd one last time. "If you still have children who speak to you," he said quietly, "don't wait for newspaper headlines before you tell them you're proud." Nobody clapped immediately. The silence mattered more. Then slowly people began applauding. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just honestly. And standing there beneath falling snow outside the Veterans Center built in Grandma Eleanor's memory, I realized something she'd understood all along. Revenge might satisfy wounded pride for a little while, but healing changes entire families. Later that evening, after everybody left and the lights dimmed inside the center, Dad and I stood alone near the front entrance watching snow collect across Maplewood. He looked older now. Softer, too. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said quietly. I slipped Grandma Eleanor's service pin back into my coat pocket. Then I looked at my father and answered honestly, "You still made it before it was too late." If this story touched something in your heart, maybe reminded you of your own family, your own parents, your own children, take a moment tonight to tell somebody what they mean to you while you still can. Sometimes people spend their whole lives waiting to feel seen, and sometimes one honest sentence can heal wounds carried for decades. Thank you for spending this time with me.